Hello and welcome to the Symposium. My name's Carl and today we're going to be talking about dilemmas. We often find ourselves in dilemmas because dilemmas come in many forms, but can be categorized into practical and moral dilemmas. Say that you have been invited to a friend's dinner party on Saturday, which you have accepted, but discover that a concert by your favourite band is on the same day. You have a desire to do A, which is attend the dinner, and a desire to do B, which is attend the concert, and you can choose to do A and not B, or B and not A, or neither A nor B, but you cannot do A and B. The source of the conflict is between your desire to attend two functions at the same time. This is what we would call a practical dilemma, not a moral dilemma. The difference is a practical dilemma requires a must, and a moral dilemma requires an ought. A practical dilemma will resolve itself, and a moral dilemma will not. If we change our example to the following, we are left with a moral dilemma instead. If we promised to be at the dinner party, and you knew your host was relying on you for some key component of the dinner, and you had also committed to attending a concert on the same day with another friend who had purchased a ticket for you and wouldn't be able to go on their own, in this situation, you both desire to do these things and are also obligated to do these things as well. You ought to do A and B, but circumstances prevent you from fulfilling both obligations, and now you must choose. So if I decided that I wanted to go to the concert instead of the dinner party, I would be forced to apologise to my friend and attempt to make arrangements to fulfil my obligation prior to the party, or else risk disappointing my friend and falling from their good graces. While we have solved the practical dilemma through our choice, we have failed to resolve our moral dilemma, our conflicting obligations to our friends. We cannot avoid what we ought to do simply by not doing it from our own lack of desire. Our obligations remain irrespective of what we want. Moral and practical dilemmas can arise from conflicting desires and conflicting circumstances. It can be that a moral dilemma is a choice between A and B, or A and not A. Moral dilemmas often owe nothing to external circumstances, as the conflict is in the ought, marking another difference between them and practical dilemmas, the difference being ought or must. The search for a universally applicable criterion of morality seems to many to be the defining feature of moral theory. However, the hypothetical possibility of this criterion existing has far-reaching and paradoxical implications about morality itself. If there were some criterion that would, in every case, at least in principle, tell us what the moral course of action would be, the implication would be that moral dilemmas aren't even real. Universal morality would eliminate moral dilemmas. That we experience moral dilemmas creates a tension between our attempts to establish a universal moral criterion and our conception of moral experience. We can make the problem more clear by delineating between practical and moral dilemmas. What makes a practical dilemma is that when two things are desired, either the circumstances we are in or the desires themselves conflict. A practical dilemma is resolved through sacrifice. Can we choose to do A or B? A moral dilemma is most highlighted between whether we ought to do something of which we are already capable. Ought we choose A or not A? If we believe that the oughts of A and not A both make moral demands of us, the dilemma seems real to us and must be resolved. If there were a universal moral criterion, then we would already have our answer, and there would be no dilemma in the first place. One particularly strong way of approaching moral dilemmas comes from E.J. Lemon in his work Moral Dilemmas. He begins the piece with an adaptation of a moral dilemma from Plato's Republic. If a friend leaves a weapon with me and I promise to return it, if he returns and demands it so he can murder his wife, do I return the weapon? Lemon presents this as an example of a dilemma in which the agent both ought and ought not to do something. In the first case, he ought to return his friend's property as he promised, but knowing his friend's intent, he also ought not to return it, as to prevent himself becoming complicit in a murder and possibly saving his wife's life, the man's wife's life. Lemon analyses the apparent contradiction in being at the same time ought and ought not to do something by exploring the logic of the modal verbs ought and must. If a man must do something, it follows that he subsequently does that thing, because if he does not do that thing, that he must do, then it cannot have been true that he must have done it in the first place. Instead, the man ought to have done something, and instead did not, making must the herald of action, and ought a speculation on the same subject. Lemon uses the example of a man at a party. If he says he must leave, it will be interpreted as his announcing his imminent departure, but if he says he ought to leave, then it will be expected that he is actually not yet ready to leave. From this, Lemon deduces that must and must not are contraries, logically, so it can't be true that one must and must not do a thing. However, this is not true in the case of ought, as his example from Plato's Republic demonstrates. Lemon cannot find a reason that ought and ought not are contrary, let alone contradictories in a logical sense, and so the dilemma is one of preference. This reasoning makes ought a moral dilemma and must a practical dilemma. In the example from Plato, it is a conflict between principle and obligation. Though the man is obliged to return the weapon, in principle he is compelled to refuse. Lemon lays out that our duties, obligations, and principles may all come into conflict with one another, as they are all sources of motivation for us. How are these moral dilemmas resolved? His first suggestion is holding to a, quote, higher order principle to set one of the sources of motivation above the rest, say putting duty before obligation or something like that. And secondly, to order the rest as suits our consciences. His main concern about the decisions that test our moral character, even if doing nothing at all might be a case of something we ought not to do, and we would have to justify a choice. Lemon considers this to be a slide into a bad faith argument, as we can only avoid our moral obligation by ceasing to be a moral agent, and so for us to act in good faith, we must address the dilemma as best we can. Lemon believes that no purely moral considerations are relevant, so we cannot simply appeal to our own moral preferences to decide the issue. Nor can we appeal to precedent, as that merely changes the decision to whether we agree with precedent or not. We may approach our decision by an appeal to consequence, leading us to make a value judgment about what are the best and worst outcomes. Now we are faced with the question of how we decide such a thing. Lemon believes that good is not the same as right, and in fact good is not a word with moral connotations, but instead means valued. It seems that Lemon here is arguing that moral questions are the means by which we reach the ends and not the end itself. Lemon then moves on to what he considers to be a more complex class of moral dilemmas. These revolve around cases where there is inconclusive evidence to suggest action one way or another. He uses an example from Sartre about the dilemma of a French youth during World War II. This is a young French man whose father is a Nazi collaborator and whose mother is grieving for the loss of his brother, and he does not know whether he should stay with his mother to care for her or leave to join the Free French forces in England. The young man is torn between his immediate desire to help an individual or run a much greater risk and travel to England to help the far greater cause of national liberation. The young man is under an obligation to stay with his mother, as she has already lost one son and couldn't bear to lose another, and on the other hand, he feels an ambiguous duty to go and fight for his country. Lemon observes this dilemma and notes that each limb of the moral dilemma is not clearly delineated. He observes that Sartre's example is a subclass of moral dilemma, in which decision-making either way marks the adoption of a changed moral outlook on the part of the young man. Lemon can't see what else other than a difficult moral decision could otherwise change someone's outlook. Lemon can't see what else other than a difficult moral decision could otherwise change someone's moral outlook. This change is frequently associated with a change in fundamental attitudes, and is akin to getting someone to understand the aesthetic value of a piece of art. Arguments can be given, but will likely not be conclusive. Put simply, Sartre's boy needs to decide if he is to become a political agent or remain as a private citizen. Lemon observes that these moral dilemmas are rare, and people may well go their entire lives without being faced with them. However, in times of crisis, where such a dilemma is presented, it is of vital importance that the situation can be reasoned through competently. He also questions the role of the philosopher in such situations, observing that contemporary discourse focuses on the philosopher's ability to analyse the situation correctly, while presumably letting the reader make the final decision for themselves. Lemon didn't believe that the philosopher's job ended there, however. Considering that perhaps nobody is qualified to give ethical advice, the philosopher's job was to detect bad reasoning from good. A corollary of this meant that the philosopher wasn't entitled to a private life. It was his duty to hold political and religious convictions in a way that was defensible through philosophical argument or not at all, unlike laymen who held them as a matter of faith. Lemon introduces an even more extreme kind of moral dilemma, one in which the agent has to make a moral decision that is completely outside of their own moral outlook, and so finds themselves completely unprepared with no prior experience with which to formulate a decision. An example of this is given in Wilt Chamberlain's negotiations with Adolf Hitler in 1938. Lemon believed that Chamberlain should have realised that Hitler was someone outside of Chamberlain's own moral experience and should have rethought his approach to the negotiations accordingly. Lemon feels it was most likely that Chamberlain deceived himself about the character of Hitler, approaching his own moral judgments in bad faith in order to avoid having to rethink his own moral worldview. Lemon's reasoning for presenting a dilemma in which the solution is outside of one's existing moral worldview is to demonstrate that when resolved correctly, that it forces a person to undergo a process of moral development by revising their moral outlook and reforming it to include provision for this new situation and others like it. Lemon returns to his aesthetic comparison and likens this to a master expanding his craft after reaching its prior limits. So is Lemon's example from Plato's Republic an example of a moral or practical dilemma? And I think that it's actually, depending on how you wish to interpret the situation, we could say on one hand that it is the circumstances that are in conflict, because if the friend had returned to collect his gun and did not appear to wish to murder his wife, we would return the gun without question. Therefore, it's the circumstance of our complicity with a potential murder that has caused us to decide we had an obligation not to return the weapon. On the other hand, we could argue that our understanding that the friend would use the weapon responsibly was intrinsic to our returning it to him, and as is the obligation of having to fulfill a promise to return one's property on time. Although we ought to return the weapon, we also ought not to help facilitate a murder, and we could consider the dilemma is intrinsic and not merely circumstantial. I personally feel that the latter interpretation has more validity. I think the mere circumstance of us being party to a murder is not sufficient to overrule the multitude of reasons we would have to refuse, moral reasons. We would have to refuse to return our friend's weapon. We have a moral duty of care also towards the friend himself to prevent them making terrible mistakes that would otherwise ruin their lives, in addition to the lives of others. A failure to do this would, in my opinion, be a failure as a friend, and so the conflict is intrinsic and not circumstantial to our pre-existing obligations. The reason that Lemon distinguishes the modal verbs must and ought is because these do contain different logic and obligations. If one must do a thing, then one announces that one must do X, it is expected that then one will then proceed to do X. However, if one only ought to do X, it is not expected that one will immediately follow through on the voiced obligation. It's still up for consideration. This is important because, as Lemon describes, one cannot at the same time find themselves in a situation where they must do X and also must not do X. They can both be false, but they cannot both be true. However, one can find themselves in a position where one ought to do X and also ought not to do X, as the Plato's potential murderer Plato's example shows, because there are no longer practical decisions where the matter will be taken out of the agent's hands if they fail to make a decision, e.g., I must go or else I shall miss my bus. But instead, they are now moral decisions that don't resolve themselves, e.g., I ought to return the gun, but I also ought not to return it. Nothing happens until the agent makes a decision. It is the question between duty, which is must, or principle, which is ought. So another example of duties, obligations, and principles all coming into contact with each other and conflict with each other is one that I've decided to pull from the air and from history, which is Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade. After arriving in the Holy Land and defeating the Muslims initially at Acre, he captures 3,000 Muslim prisoners of war on the journey after the battle. Richard has an obligation to capture Jerusalem, as this is the purpose of the crusade. He has a duty to ensure his men are safe under his leadership, and he also believed in the principle that prisoners of war should be treated fairly when captured. Unfortunately for Richard, these were all in conflict. Terms could not be reached with Saladin, his primary opponent, for ransom or prisoner exchange, and the crusade demanded he press on to Jerusalem. What should Richard do with the prisoners? If he releases them, he leaves 3,000 hostile soldiers at his back to harry and disrupt his army. This is a failure of his duty of care towards his men. If he stayed in place to preserve the prisoners, he fails in his obligation to complete the crusade and capture the Holy Land. If he murders the prisoners, he violates his own principles. In the end, Richard was forced to compromise his principles, as the demands of duty and obligation were too great for him to maintain his moral standards. He had the prisoners killed in what became known as the Massacre of the Idaea. Lemon says that we cannot solve moral dilemmas by appealing to our own moral views, because the dilemma is not made of purely moral considerations. Excepting for rare circumstances, most moral dilemmas include a layering of different considerations, not only which ideal would be most preferable, but also by the means by which the ideal is pursued, and then the consequences of our actions. To appeal to only our own moral views is to ignore or dismiss the harm that may be incurred by what we do. It is to say that the ends justify the means. Moral dilemmas cannot be solved by walking away from them, because they are not physical, they are conceptual. A practical dilemma is grounded in reality, and resolves itself if the wrong action, which can be no action, is taken. However, a moral dilemma cannot resolve itself, because the real question is how we interpret our own moral worldview in the light of events that are happening, how we consider our principles when compared to our duties and obligations. As Lemon observes, there are exceedingly few purely moral dilemmas, meaning that a moral decision is formed by events as well as our moral outlook. The questions they raise remain regardless of what actually happens. The must requirement of a pragmatic choice might resolve itself, but the ought dilemma is in our heads and requires a better understanding of our own beliefs in order to be resolved. The very reason that we have a moral dilemma itself is because we consulted our own moral outlook, as in we assessed the situation with regards to our principles, duties, and obligations, and further consultation of our own moral beliefs would surely only return the same result, that we have a dilemma. Lemon believes that his example of the French boy deciding whether to stay with his mother or join the Free French forces was dilemmatic in the full sense, because the boy is confronted with both an ought and ought not scenario. On the one hand, the boy has some duty and obligation to stay and care for his mother, but on the other, he has a duty and obligation to his country. He ought to stay and help his mother, but he also ought not to stay because it only aids the Nazi occupation if he does. There are various arguments for or against presented as to why he should or should not go, and it is up to the boy to decide which ones to follow based on his principles. Any decision that the boy makes will result in a change to his moral outlook, as he decides to value one principle over another. When compared to Plato's moral dilemma about returning a weapon, we can see a striking difference. The return of the weapon might be an obligation, and one might be morally obliged to try and fulfill obligations, but when this principle conflicts with another higher order principle, such as do not be complicit in murder, the answer is obvious, and there really is very little in the way of a dilemma to actually be had. Lemon doesn't actually seem to provide a reason that he thinks that there will be a changed moral outlook, but I think what he means is that a person's moral outlook is determined by their duties, principles, and obligations, and it is when they conflict that a person is forced to reassess the value that they place on each thing, where it's otherwise revealed to be inconsistent. Say two principles of equal value, I should look after my mother, I should fight for my country, are in conflict, and now the boy must decide which in the circumstances will prevail. He must place a higher value on one of these principles than the other. Lemon's questioning of the role of the philosopher in their analysis of a moral dilemma is definitely worth talking about. Should the philosopher just lay out the arguments and then allow the reader to decide what the good and bad arguments are for themselves? In Lemon's view, the job of the philosopher does not stop there and should provide value judgments about the arguments as they have been presented. However, this does come with a price, which is the point of the philosopher being no longer entitled to simply hold a belief as an article of faith. If he presumes to make moral judgments about the dilemmas of others, then his own beliefs become public property, and he is no longer entitled to hold a belief without being able to form a philosophically defensible argument for it. Whether one agrees with this is a matter of their own interpretation of the philosopher's role, but if one believes that it is merely the philosopher's responsibility to present the arguments because the philosopher is equipped to do so, then the burden of responsibility for choosing the good from the bad is on the individuals the philosopher's work is presented to. If one believes the philosopher should present or promote some arguments over others, then it is only fair that the philosopher must be ready to defend any of their own beliefs from others. Neither interpretation is inconsistent. We then move on to John Stuart Mill's greatest happiness principle from his work Utilitarianism, which holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. What Mill means by this strong statement is that happiness is the promotion of pleasure, the absence of pain, and the reverse being the promotion of misery and the promotion of suffering. This formulation is derived from Mill's belief that the promotion of pleasure and absence of pain are the only things that are desirable ends, either for the pleasure inherent in the thing itself or as a facilitator to such ends, regardless of the forms that they take. Mill considers the comparison of utilitarians to Epicureans in this regard, Epicurus being an ancient Greek philosopher who was famous for his philosophy of, shall we say, wanton self-indulgence, and presents a common defense of their position, and this was the same sort of defense that Epicurus gives for his own position. If the only purpose in life is sensual pleasure, then how are men any better than swine? To which the answer that Mill gives is that it is the accusers who hold mankind in contempt by making the comparison. Men are capable of much higher pleasures than consumption and fornication. A beast's pleasures do not satisfy a man because men are not mere beasts. And Mill demands that all Epicurean theories account for the pleasures of the intellect, the pleasures of the feeling and an imagination, and of the moral sentiments, and place them above base desires. Bentham, a utilitarian predecessor to Mill, considered merely the quality of pleasure and not the quantity. Mill disagrees with this view and believes that there are different types of pleasure that are more desirable than others. To decide if one pleasure is more valuable than another, Mill suggests that we can only appeal to popular opinion on the matter. If almost all who experience one pleasure give a decided preference, irrespective of moral obligation, then that is the more desirable pleasure. Mill makes another strong statement, very strong statement, to the effect that it is an unquestionable fact that people who have experienced and understood two pleasures give, quote, a most marked preference to the one that employs their higher faculties. From this, Mill observes that it is not a common opinion that if one were able to degrade their intellectual capacity, one would willingly choose to do so. For example, would you willingly choose to get a lobotomy even though there was nothing wrong with you? Men would not consent to be changed into beasts, the instructed into the ignorant, the intelligent to become foolish, if only to equalize their desires with those beneath them, unless they had found themselves in the most extreme unhappiness. Mill believes that a creature of higher intelligence requires more than carnal pleasures to satisfy him, and likely suffers more when hurt. He is also not likely to give up his capacity for higher intelligence. Mill believes this is because of their sense of dignity, and the scope of their capacities is greater than those of lesser intellect. Those of lower capacities for pleasure will find them fulfilled with much more ease. Mill believes it is better to be a dissatisfied human than a satisfied pig, or Socrates dissatisfied than a satisfied fool. And if the pig or the fool disagree, then it is only because they only know one side of the story. Mill reasons that if utility is the source of moral obligation, utility may be invoked to resolve moral dilemmas, as the, quote, common umpire that is entitled to be the ultimate source from which a decision can be made between two conflicting moral systems. Mill is claiming that the greatest happiness principle is that actions are morally right in proportion with how effectively and bountifully they produce happiness, and morally wrong in that they do the reverse, to produce unhappiness. The first problem that we might encounter is Mill's expected discussion of what constitutes pleasure and pain. This will be the stage of an unending moral debate with no firm resolutions, which leads on to the second problem, which is that the greatest happiness principle seems to give license to quite terrible things. If our moral framework is based on producing the greatest pleasure and minimum pain, then surely keeping a human being in a state of delusion using pleasure-inducing drugs is the greatest moral good that one man is capable of doing for another. A third concern I have with the greatest happiness principle is that Mill defines happiness as pleasure without pain. I believe there are other components as to what constitutes being happy, and many of them might involve pain. For example, I have often taken exercise that has left me in moderate amounts of pain, but that made me very happy that I'd fulfilled the purpose of the exercise. Pain is not necessarily outside of the realm of what is required to make a person happy, and in fact might be a crucial component. Mill seems to be considering pain to be disease, famine, or injury, something inflicted upon the person and not something that the person chooses to inflict upon themselves. And my fourth concern is the scope of the principle itself, which promotes the greatest happiness seems to work well on an interpersonal level with individual choices, but it seems to scale up very poorly. When scaled to the size of a nation, it can conceivably be argued that if it would make the Germans happy, if it would promote the greatest happiness among the Germans, then maybe the Jews should have been exterminated. If the greatest happiness comes at the expense of a minority, how is it not justified to deal with that minority as one sees fit? I also take issue with the idea that he says that the higher pleasures are universally agreed to be preferred. I don't know if that's true. I think that many people actually seem to value carnal pleasures above intellectual ones, even if they are capable of them. I don't believe that anything is unquestionable, and the very idea of experiencing something equally is at best hypothetical, in my opinion, as the experiences are subjective and unmeasurable. Mill's claim that men would not consent to be reduced to the intellectual level of beasts if presented with the option, which Mill uses as proof that the higher pleasures are more valued, is something I don't actually believe is direct confirmation of his claim, because there could be other reasons. This could be attributed to a desire simply not to have one's options restricted unduly, even if those options are not one's primary preference. In this case, it could be that intellectual pursuits are pleasurable, but carnal pursuits are even more so. If Mill is correct when he observes that higher mental capacities presumably provide greater capacity for pleasure and pain, it could also be that a person does not wish to be changed into a lower form of life, as they will lose a quantity of pleasure gained from these base indulgences. The amount of pleasure a pig can gain is not going to be as much as a human because of their intellect, in Mill's view. If we return back to Lemon's Platonic example of what we should do about returning the gun, thankfully though, Mill has actually provided us with a really easy way of resolving the moral dilemma using the greatest happiness principle. It will surely not create the greatest happiness for the man's wife to be murdered, and so we are morally obliged not to return the gun, which resolves the apparent ought to, ought not to dilemma. Under Mill's formulation, we ought not to return the gun even if we have a property obligation to do so. Lemon essentially agrees that Mill's greatest happiness principle can be used as a moral umpire, but in the event of a dilemma, he does not agree with Mill that it is the first principle of morality, but is instead a practical method of resolving a moral dilemma. Lemon notes that this is somewhat paradoxical, however, as if a moral dilemma can be resolved with a practical decision, the moral dilemma itself was only hypothetical and wasn't really real.